By the way, I want to mention, we could possibly get a completion of a 9-count sell signal on the daily chart for the S&P 500 cash tomorrow. Futures actually finished a 13-count on Friday. So again, you're seeing some price exhaustion. We've got these divergences on the weekly chart, the MACD on the S&P, the awesome oscillator. We'll be looking to see if we get a red bar before the weekends or on it in next week. You don't need to have a red bar to start the reversal. You could get it watching here in the weekly time frame. These divergences complete on the MACD, on the awesome oscillator. Here in the daily time frame, we'll begin to see those divergences begin to play out in the weekly time frame. Still get a green bar today. Here's our third green bar. We'll be watching for a red bar. If that begins to play out, you got to get a reversal of conditions and see momentum flip, and then the trend signals flip. Right now, my signals remain bullish. Thing here for the NASDAQ, again, while we have our fourth green awesome oscillator bar, again, a divergence is developing just like on the MACD. And again, price has drifted higher on very, very light volume over the 4th of July Independence Day holiday. Watching to see if the divergence begins to play out here in the daily time frame, and if it does, then we can begin to see it play out in those weekly time frames. See the divergences on the awesome oscillator, the MACD, on the RSI. It's all over the place on NASDAQ and the S&P. This is the NASDAQ weekly chart. Remind you, we got this double sequence count reversal signal at 13, followed by a 9 on the S&P 500 weekly chart. We'll be watching to see what the candlestick looks like this week. Sometimes you get these 9 counts, you go a little higher, and then you turn. Other times, like we did over here, we went a little bit higher, and then we turned. Other times, you turn immediately. We'll be watching to see how it unfolds here with Powell's testimony and the inflation data later in the week with the CPI on Thursday, PPI, wholesale inflation on Friday. We're getting this 9 count right here last week. I'm going to set one up tomorrow on NASDAQ and S&P. NASDAQ did the same thing in the weekly time frame. We closed out the week with a 9 count reversal signal of 13, followed by a 9 double sequence count sell signal, and again, these possible head and shoulder patterns. We had a 9 count over here, went just slightly above that level, and eventually it played out and gave us the correction. This one will likely produce a reversal, and again, if we get a reversal, we could move back to the neckline of the head and shoulders. Again, stock market is going to likely follow Bitcoin's lead. They have a positive correlation. It's already dropped 27.5%, probably going to rebound as the S&P and NASDAQ begin to sell off. And again, Bitcoin moved back down to this neckline and overthrew it with a double top pattern. S&P will likely move back down. NASDAQ will likely move back down to these necklines. We're getting these 9 count sell signals, 13 followed by a 9 double sequence count sell signals in the weekly time frame. We're going to set up a possible 9 count on NASDAQ. NASDAQ currently has a 7 of a 9 count. That means that in 2 more sessions, we could get a 9 count. The 8 or 9 count have to be the high of the count in order for it to be a perfected sell signal. We had a 9 count over here, and NASDAQ pulled back. We had a 9 count at that same time with S&P, and it went kind of sideways. The 9 count finishes, and there's no guarantee that it will. If we start a reversal without it, again, over here, you only made it to bar 7 or bar 8, and you didn't complete it. But if we do complete it, we'll have another 9 count sell signal on our hands. Again, this one produced a reversal, or a pullback, pardon me. This one went sideways, got an immediate trend extension, and then got a little bit of a pullback without a perfected signal. But you had a little 9-9 right there. You could get another 9-9 right here. It does in fact complete by Wednesday. The 9 count does not have to be the high of the count. It could be bar 8, which would be tomorrow. If you don't see it play out like we saw over here, then again, get a price slip closing below the bar from 4 bars ago. As long as we don't close below the bar from 4 bars ago tomorrow, we'll get bar 8, and the same for bar 9. As long as you don't close below the bar from 4 bars ago. If you do, then you get a price flip. You're starting to go sideways or starting to go down. NASDAQ daily chart. Here we have a 7 of a 9 count. Above that upper Bollinger Band, now we're pushing down off of it. We'll be watching to see if this count completes or not. If it does, that may take QQQ to 500, which could be a major psychological level of resistance. I don't know that it will play out. We'll see what happens. Look at that divergence forming on those 60-minute charts as I talked about with those RSIs. S&P has this rising wedge. I've been talking about it on the weekly chart, and I showed you over the weekend on the daily chart here. It has this rising wedge. and we're slamming up into the trend line, and we have a 9 count today in the daily time frame. Again, we already got those 9 count, 13 nines weekly time frame. Sometimes you go a little higher and then you turn. Other times you turn immediately. I'll be watching to see what becomes of the 9 count here in the daily time frame. Counts show price exhaustion. You tend to get pullbacks or reversals surrounding it. Here we had a pullback. Here we got a 9 count, got it perfected up here, and we went sideways. Well, NASDAQ pulled back. S&P went sideways with that 9 count. And again, we could form one tomorrow. We're coming right up. Let me just bring this up close so you can see it. We're coming right up to the trend line. Last time we tagged it right here, and we're coming right up to it. This is back to the July 2023 high, forming a massive rising wedge in the weekly time frame. And here it is in the daily time frame. You got an 8 of a 9. You got a candle of indecision for the doji. So even if we turn down tomorrow, as long as we don't close below the bar from 4 bars ago tomorrow, you can still have a perfected sell signal on the S&P 500. You'll have the 8 count being the high of the count. Doji, a candle of indecision. It could be a continuation or reversal pattern, but we're forming this count here, and again, got the 9 counts completed last week on the weekly charts with NASDAQ and S&P. I'm bringing this up close so you can see it. Again, we're hitting the trend line right here. We're hitting it, and we were just below it. We're hitting it. Talked about that. We're just slightly under it over the weekend, and again, we're getting this doji closing back below the upper Bollinger Band. So if the doji is a peak, we get a red bar tomorrow, you can have an evening star reversal. You can have a 3-day pattern, a wide range bar, a doji, followed by a red wide range red bar, a reversal. The doji could be a continuation or a reversal bar. That's why I'm saying, look, it could be that we get this pattern here. If we get a sell-off with Powell tomorrow, then you can have an evening star. This would be a red bar here, and you can see that happen. The doji, if it's a continuation, could still push us higher, but you do have this rally on lighter volume, and now you get this candle of indecision. Again, we had our short trading week last week, and we had a 4-day winning streak on the short trading week for the Independence Day holiday. In the intraday time frame, we have these little tiny head and shoulder patterns that, again, could be in play here. If we start moving back and we get the evening star reversal, we'll be watching if we get it here in the daily time frame. So again, does this mark a peak and we start closing below this low? That would be bearish. If we start a reversal, rather than getting a divergence on the RSI in the 60-minute time frame, you could come back down here and get a lower high if this head and shoulders pattern tries to set up. We'll see what happens with it. But the doji could be a continuation or a reversal. Again, my signals remain bullish, but again, we're forming negative divergences in the daily and the weekly time frame. We're advancing on very, very light volume, watching to see, do we go higher? What becomes of this doji? Is it a continuation or a reversal pattern? Do we get a 9 count being the high of the count, or is the 8 bar today? 9 count give us a reversal, the 13.9 in the weekly time frame to play out with those negative divergences I've been showing you in the weekly time frame. S&P daily right here. Similar pattern on NASDAQ. NASDAQ got a little spinning top. Again, we now have a 5-day winning streak. And here, if we start to turn back down, you've got a little tiny head and shoulders that could be in play here. If we don't form divergences on the RSIs immediately, and we start to sell off, you may try to come back up and get it with the lower high later if this pattern ends up playing out. Too early to tell. That is a possibility on those intraday charts. This is the daily chart here, and we have this spinning top candlestick. Candle of indecision. Now got the topping tip in. Quickly, we have the rising wedge on the S&P. We're through the upper boundary of the channel to hit this trend line right here, and we're slamming into it right now. This is the trend line going back to the July high there, slamming into it right now. So hitting, or just under the trend line from the May peak, you'll see in this video, which is the upper channel line in the 60-minute time frame. If we exclude the channel, the topping tail on that, you're slamming into that one right now. You've got the divergence on the RSI. You've got the divergence on the MACD here. It's all over the place. Could we see Powell or the CPI inflation data begin to move the market and allow these divergences to play out? Watching to see if that is the case or not. Signals remain bullish, but you have divergences now in the daily time frame, and here looming over the weekly charts. Not just on the RSI, it's on the Awesome Oscillator, it's on the MACD, it's on the Price Oscillator here with momentum, it's everywhere. Let me bring up another one here. Again, divergences. These divergences have marked tops and bottoms and major corrective moves. Divergences begin to play out and produce a pretty violent move. It'll start playing catch up to Bitcoin like it did in 2022. If we do form the top with these divergences, I think you got a pretty good shot that that's going to happen, which is suggesting to me that we're going to get a September pivot or November pivot from the Fed, one or the other, just after the election or in September. We formed the top over here, we came back to this level. You've got this head and shoulders pattern right here, or this is part of the shoulder and that's still part of the head. Either way, you got the head and shoulders pattern. Could see the same thing set up here. Continue to have this divergence between the AD line, advanced and declining issues, and the S&P 500. Again, we're hitting this trend line. Now, this is a trend line, the upper boundary of my channel on the 60-minute chart. This right here is excluding the shadow. If we include the shadow, it's just a little bit higher. But if you exclude the shadow, you're slamming right into it right now. And you'll see this on the 60-minute chart and on the rising wedge on the daily chart. But again, this is problematic, and you've got this divergence that has formed, which again could be suggesting a reversal. We have the same divergence going on with market breadth indicators all over the place, but very important divergence is between the S&P equal weight and the S&P cash. Again, you're getting the doji here. S&P is making new highs. Again, you're getting a divergence in the most recent price action right here from this previous peak that was made over here. This larger divergence from the peak over here at the May high, and then going all the way back to the March peak over here where we had that little miniature double top before this corrective move. Again, we're making a lower high. That's the trend line. If you connect the peak May and over here, the lower high. We're diverging. We have multiple point divergences. This is, again, problematic. Again, the Magnificent Seven is up about 1/3 of the cap there of the S&P. It controls 1/3 of the S&P. Know that the stocks, the majority of stocks are not moving above their 50 and 20-day moving averages, and that they're making a series of lower highs. S&P is making higher highs. This is a huge red flag. If we start to reverse here, as the 10 and 20 are now trying to drop below the 50, and we've lost the 100 period, and we're hovering right around it. We've lost it, and then we're kind of jumping back up above it. Not seen here, but if we break down here again, and we start to reverse, we could see new lows with the equal weight and a move back towards this level with the S&P 500. Multiple points of negative divergence between the equal weight and the S&P. Now we're getting one here with today's new highs, and again, very problematic. It may go higher if we complete the 9 count, overthrow some of these trend lines, but again, you are hitting some trend lines of resistance, and you are forming these divergences. 9 count, 13.9 in the weekly, and you've got a potential 9 count that's going to complete tomorrow on the S&P. I want to continue to point out the Russell is diverging with the S&P. This is what we had at the 2022 top over here, and again, S&P made a new high. The Russell did not. We're seeing the same thing here. The Russell's making a lower high. S&P's making a higher high. You have another divergence going on here as the S&P's coming up and slamming up into that trend line from the 2021 and 2022 peaks right there, and hitting the trend line here on the Russell. Again, turn down off of it, forming the divergence in the most recent price action. Again, you're probably going to see major reversal happen when we begin to see the divergences play out on the weekly charts. So much complacency in the market right now that when it happens, people are going to go into shock. Quickly, I want to continue to warn that Bitcoin is diverging with the S&P 500. That's a huge red flag for the stock market because, again, that's what happened over here. Bitcoin had a dramatic sell-off, diverged with the S&P 500. S&P played catch-up, dropped 15%. Marked a reversal point as it has done at other times in history, as I've talked about. This goes all the way back to 2017. It diverged over and over again at at turning points where reversals have taken place. We've already seen Bitcoin drop 27.5%, S&P, and it may not be done yet. Signals are still bearish. Getting signals that are warning that a bottom is trying to carve out. We're getting a bullish diversion as the S&P is forming negative diversions. Bullish diversions on Bitcoin, negative. And again, there's that short-term decoupling. So keep that in mind. It's a huge warning sign. No way the stock market could go down. That's what the crypto people were saying 27.5% ago. They're saying there's no way this is going to happen. And the bottom fell out of Bitcoin and it lost over a quarter of its value just like that over the course of 4 weeks. Back to the center line, S&P is probably going back or to the trough low that separated the two peaks. S&P is probably going back towards the line right here that separates these two peaks for a head and shoulders. Well, Bitcoin is forming a bullish divergence with indicators. S&P is forming a negative divergence. A lot of indicators, momentum with the MACD, with the RSI, with the histogram, and so on with the money flow. It's all over the place. I'll be watching the doji right here, and again, signals still remain bullish. We tried to see momentum signals start to flip. They turned right back to bullish. My signals remain bullish for momentum and with trend. If that starts to change, then you got a shot at a reversal. My signals remain bullish, but negative divergences are forming in the daily time frame, and those complete. We could see the weekly divergences finish in the weekly time frame. Same thing with NASDAQ. We saw the signals, momentum signals turn bearish briefly. We went sideways. We had that correction, 9-count sell signal, and we got a pullback, and then we resumed the advance. Talking about the 9-count, we're currently on bar 7 of a 9. Play out the S&P is up to bar 8. We'll see what happens, but you've got these divergences going on here in the daily time frame all over the place here with momentum. And again, as I've mentioned, with the MACD, the RSI, the money flow, and the awesome oscillators, it's everywhere. This could be warning that a top is getting ready to happen, or it could have just marked the correction. I'll be watching to see if I start getting other warning signs. Momentum had shifted bearish briefly, turned back to bullish. My signals for momentum and the trend remain bullish. That has to change if we're going to see a reversal. The divergences are developing in the daily time frame, and they have been forming on the weekly chart. When the awesome oscillators finish those divergences, we'll start to see it play out in the weekly time frame. Be this week with Powell and the inflation data, possibly reverse off the trend lines I'll be talking about in this video. Please support the channel with the link directly below. That allows me to be able to provide you this information. Like the chart, to like the indicators, let me know that by supporting the channel today. You could take a moment to do that. I would really appreciate it. I thank you for your consideration for that. As the NASDAQ's getting the 7 of the 9 count in the daily time frame, again, we're coming up and we're slamming right up into this upper channel line here that I've talked about. On the daily 60-minute time frame, as divergences are forming and possible head and shoulders formation. NVIDIA breakdown from the bear flag. We could see NASDAQ begin to turn. NASDAQ's moving higher on lighter volume, while NVIDIA is making a lower high. Help last week by Apple. NASDAQ's gone up into the upper channel line area, and we're stalling there at the moment. And again, just drawing a line from here to here that is parallel with these two lower boundaries right there, hitting it. S&P is hitting, going back to 2023. S&P is also hitting the trend line from the more recent highs. But again, you got this divergence going on with pring parameter. Again, still may overthrow this level if the 9 count completes, but if we start reversing, this divergence could start playing out with pring parameter. We have the possibility of still pushing higher on NASDAQ. This is NASDAQ 60-minute chart up close. Again, we've got this peak. We're just kind of going sideways. If we pop higher, you could still get a divergence right here now or sell off and come back and do it later. If you start to sell off right here, right now, again, you've got the possibility of these head and shoulder patterns here. Didn't draw that very straight, but you see what I'm saying on these 60-minute charts. So again, we'll be watching. We are starting to get it right here now with the last bar of trading. We are inching higher there above the previous bar. So we're going slightly higher and getting that diversion. So again, we might just get it right here, right now with Powell. And if we do, we'll be watching. Do we get a gap and trap or of reversal the first or second day with Powell? Start getting some weakness here and then come back and do something like that. We'll see what happens. Again, signals remain bullish right now, but you've got these negative divergences in the weekly time frame. You got it in the daily time frame forming here on the RSI in the 60-minute time frame. but it may not be done yet. It may just give us a sell-off, and we may get a larger one. We'll see what happens. See the signals turn back to bearish in the daily time frame. Complete the divergences on the awesome oscillators in the daily time frame for the negative divergences to play out in the weekly time frame. NASDAQ 60-minute chart here. But again, going back to the daily time frame, we're hitting that channel line going back to this peak right here in April. And again, we're connecting those levels. We're hitting that level right there, which is parallel to this level. We'll see if that acts as resistance with these divergences on NASDAQ. Again, this is the head and shoulders I was talking about in the intraday time frame. If we start moving back below the 10 and 20 period moving average. So we'll be watching to see what happens with Powell. Remain bullish. Can they remain that way? Negative divergences lurking over the daily chart now here on the MACD and the RSI, as well as on the weekly chart. Now again, NASDAQ, we had the momentum roll over, start to roll over there. Price inched a little bit higher. Again, could be forming a little divergence here. It may not be done yet. And again, we still may overthrow this level if signals start to reverse. Possible channel here in play though. Quickly, NASDAQ 60-minute chart. Again, we're inching just a little bit higher, and we're getting a little tiny divergence as we do that. Just a little tiny one there, barely going higher. Again, it still may not be done. We still may turn up and get something like that right here now, or that may be it, and we turn down and we still come back up here later for one. If we start to sell off and then come back up into that level like that. Or if we start to get a bigger sell-off, again, it may validate a lower high later on. There's no guarantee it sets up a divergence, but it very well could. Regardless, NASDAQ is overbought. For S&P, we came up to just under that trend line there, just slightly. Again, this blue trend line is parallel these lows over here, and then again connecting this level and this level. Again, we're just under that level. We may slam up into it and turn down. I have the red trend line connecting this low, and this peak right here would take us a little bit higher up here. So again, I'll be watching to see what happens. Again, we saw momentum roll over, but we're just kind of drifting sideways, slightly pulling back. NASDAQ closed above the high. S&P got a lower high. Again, if we see things turn back up, we could get divergences forming immediately or start to sell off and then get them later. And again, see how all of that unfolds with Powell's congressional testimony for 2 days and the inflation data later in the week. So again, well, NASDAQ went slightly higher, S&P lower high. Again, we'll see if a divergence tries to develop here immediately, going up and hitting that trend line or the red trend line that I've talked about. Or again, do we start to turn down and move towards the 50 level and then come back up and either confirm a lower high or a divergence, moving maybe back down, again, towards this horizontal support. You have a possible head and shoulders pattern. If that is the case, if we break this trend line, end up back testing it, you can get a right shoulder. So again, those are the possibilities. Again, we'll be watching to see if does the market start to see divergences in the daily time frame and the weekly time frame begin now to play out. Got it on the MACDs, the RSIs in the daily time frame. MACD rolled over at the end of the session. By the way, I do want to mention again the trend line here. The blue trend line in the 60-minute time frame is from this May high, connected to this high right here with our bear flag there in June, mid-June, and that's the channel line I'm connecting. The trend line I'm showing you in the daily time frame goes all the way back to 2023, along with that weekly trend line. Look at the daily chart of the S&P. Again, if we include the shadow here, we're just under it. If we exclude the shadow, we're just under it. If we include the shadow, we're right at that level right now. You got this rising wedge. Now, these are the trend lines here. If we exclude the shadow in the daily time frame, you got a really nice looking rising wedge. But still, that is the upper boundary of the channel there in the 60-minute time frame, connecting the lows here and here. You've got this rising wedge. You've got these negative divergences. You got it here on the RSI. You've got it here on the MACD. So we're going to be watching to see if this begins to play out. If you begin to reverse here, again, coming back down, we can get this head and shoulders that I've talked about. And again, that would take us back to the 4,900 area, where I think that if we did, we could sell off the Fed meeting into July, or by there on into early August, attempt a rebound into September if that is going to be where the Fed does the pivot, the first rate cut. Candle of indecision, 8 of a 9 count. Tomorrow we get the 9 count. We'll be watching to see what happens. Got a possible hanging man on Apple today. Again, Apple has been helping the NASDAQ. NVIDIA is not making new highs. The NASDAQ made new highs without NVIDIA. That's problematic as NVIDIA is forming a bear flag. Apple is forming negative divergences on the MACD and the RSI. A possible hanging man today, these negative divergences in place on Apple. Here on the daily chart. Now, NVIDIA was up 1.91% today, so just under 2%. It's up $2.41. NVIDIA peaked back on June 20th. And again, I've talked about this bear flag we got going on. And if we see it have a downward resolution, we're up in the upper boundary of the flag. If we see a breakdown at some point this week with either Powell, the inflation data, or maybe both, we'll see what happens. But if we break down with NVIDIA and we see the diversions play out with Apple, then again, I would be watching to see if NVIDIA would come back down towards this level. You do have the possible head and shoulders, just like you have on the S&P and the NASDAQ, forming the same pattern as NVIDIA. The bear flag doesn't play out. We turn back up. You could still form a divergence here. You don't have to get one. We've had this rally back up, and again, it's formed this really nice looking bear flag as a 10 has crossed a 20-period moving average. Could be we sell off into the FOMC meeting by late July or on into early August. If we do, and there's hopes for rate cuts after a sell-off, we could see a right shoulder develop should this pattern set up. It's too early to tell if it will, but again, you can see what I'm looking at, a left shoulder ahead and possibly a right shoulder. If we do get this bear flag playing out, giving us a big sell-off, negative divergence, not here in the daily time frame, but we do in the weekly time frame with this high that formed on June 20th. Again, the Fed, it's only pricing in one cut for the year, and it's been hovering around 2 Fed fund futures, so they're not really believing that. And again, we could see by September or just after the election in November. The Fed meeting is right after the general election in the United States. But again, it could be that if we do sell off, we start getting hopes of a cut, hurry up and cut, and then we get it. Be careful what you wish for. If you get the first cut again, the market will have likely peaked or peak with that. Good chance the negative divergences are suggesting we're going to get the pivot, lowering rates. We could get it as soon as September, wrap up the summer and move into the fall. And if we sold off with that, again, we could sell off from September into the election surrounding uncertainty, as we've done in the past with other elections. Once we get the election results, November, we can have holiday rallies surrounding Christmas and going on to the new year. We could rally into January. This is a possibility if the bear flag gets a downward resolution, we take out the 50-period moving average, start moving to come back and fill some of these gaps here, moving back towards support. If you do, you got a shot at this head and shoulders. This is something I'm paying attention to because NVIDIA has formed that negative divergence in the weekly time frame. We don't have it here in the daily time frame, but you sure do have it in the weekly time frame. The rally back up still has the MACD bearish at this point. So either this pattern is going to fail and we're going to start moving back to test the high, or you're going to start seeing a breakdown of this pattern. We tested the upper boundary today and got a little topping tail there at the upper boundary of the bear flag pattern for NVIDIA. Why am I talking about NVIDIA? NASDAQ has followed NVIDIA, but right now there's a short-term decoupling. NVIDIA is making a lower high, NASDAQ is making a higher high. So again, that's a red flag because NASDAQ has been following NVIDIA in lockstep. It's just one stock that is driving the market higher. I've shown you market breadth indicators where you have market making new highs, but more than half of the stocks are below their 20 and their 50-day moving averages. Make up the S&P, NASDAQ, we're seeing the same thing. Again, it's a huge red flag. We're also seeing the equal weight diverging with the S&P 500, another huge red flag. So we'll be watching this bear flag on NVIDIA here in the daily time frame. Wait, if the price of NVIDIA starts breaking down, NASDAQ will eventually follow it. Divergence right now could be a huge red flag. But if they both go down, again, NASDAQ has that neckline around 17,000, the S&P around 4,900. Again, if we try to rally, then you've got the possibility of the right shoulder. And again, assuming that we get a rate cut in September rather than November or December, you can be on track for 2 cuts still. And again, as I've said, even though I predicted that the Fed would lower it down to 1 or none for 2024, I still think they'll end up cutting probably 2 times this year in all likelihood. Say this, we saw the unemployment rate ticking up, and that's a sign of recession. It's above 4%, 4.1% now. Goes just a little bit higher, it will trigger the recession signal on the 3-month moving average of the unemployment rate 1 year ago was just a little bit higher. So again, it will be predicting, and oftentimes see it bottom as we've done the unemployment rate and begin to move off of the lows. That's when the stock market tops. I've talked about this in the past at great length and detail. Let's take a look at the weekly chart of NVIDIA real fast. Here's a weekly chart. We have that negative divergence. Now, if that bear flag doesn't play out in the daily time frame, again, we could still form a divergence here in the most recent price action if we try to challenge this high. If we don't, if the topping tail holds, the divergence plays out, we start breaking the 70 level here on the RSI, then we could establish a lower high and move to get a lower low if our bear flag plays out there on NVIDIA. So watch that, because it is diverging with the S&P 500, with the S&P and more importantly with NASDAQ. Interesting is the Dow is forming the same bear flag, and again the Dow is diverging with NASDAQ. The Dow's not making a new high. It has this double top over here, and again NASDAQ is making a new high. They're diverging from one another. It's just like the S&P and the small caps, represented by the Russell, are diverging from one another. It's turning off a major trend line, long-term trend line. S&P makes new highs. Again, this is what you see at reversals, major tops. What we saw in 2022, we're getting the same thing right now. Here we had a rally on the Dow, and I've been watching this bear flag on the Dow. Again, we're up there just above the 78.6 Fibonacci, but have struggled to close above it. We got a topping tail today. We had a 300-point rally on the Dow early on in the session, gave it all back. Dow could confirm a lower high on the RSI and on the MACD. It's trying to form a divergence here in this most recent price action now with today's peak. So we'll be watching what happens. Do we start seeing the bear flag play out here or with NVIDIA? Again, we're making a lower high. Could we confirm a lower high and see the MACD roll over? We are forming a divergence also on the histogram, which is the difference between the MACD line and the signal line. Today, again, the S&P and NASDAQ ended higher, really kind of going flat for most of the session, but fluctuating up and down. Closed slightly higher. Dow closed down, getting that topping tail down 31 points. The S&P was up 5.5 points, up 0.1%. The NASDAQ was up 0.28%. Russell was up just over 0.5%, and the VIX was down 0.88%. We got that bottoming tail on the VIX on Friday. It is not getting confirmed. A hammer candlestick on the VIX. VIX has a discrepancy with the S&P 500 in that the S&P is moving to new highs. The VIX has not moved to new lows. We got that bullish hammer candlestick. We tried to get above the 10 and 20 today. We couldn't do it. And we went up to the 50 and stalled and turned back down. The S&P got a doji candlestick, a candle of indecision, right here at this trend line right here. And again, we're at that trend line going all the way back to the July peak, where we're still under the one, just slightly under the one of the channel. On the hourly chart, here's a 10-year yield ahead of Fed Chair Powell's testimony before Congress. Again, we've bounced off this trend line. We have this nice-looking channel. We'll be watching to see if the trend line holds. Do we break it or do we bounce as we get of indecision here in the form of a doji on the S&P 500? Form that divergence on the RSI in the 60-minute time frame, as I've talked about. We don't have to, but we could have a divergence on the daily charts, have a divergences on the weekly charts. Eventually, the Fed's going to pivot, and this will likely end up going down. We still could see a pop higher for the short term going into a Fed pivot but eventually it will likely to come back down as yield curve uninverts. Right now you have an inverted yield curve where short-term rates are higher than long-term rates. See that unwind, it will begin to mark a topping process for the market and the recession, telling us that it's getting much closer, and we're about to have it again. When Fed is about to pivot or surrounding the pivot, we should begin to see the yield curve begin to uninvert. We'll be watching. Do we get any traction here with Powell? Do we start breaking the trend line here? Again, it's interesting. Well, we've had this short period of decoupling between Bitcoin and the S&P 500. S&P's risen. Well, the yield has dropped. Your yield has dropped, but the dollar has risen. Bitcoin has dropped. So kind of interesting there. Often the 10-year yield and the dollar will move in lockstep together. What's been going on? Kind of interesting.